everyone. Good afternoon, I suppose, depending on your time zone. Before we get things started here, just a quick reminder to pay attention to GDC's code of conduct with all of your chat exchanges this morning. Just be nice, be thoughtful, not too difficult, easy stuff. So our speaker today is the prolific game composer, Winifred Phillips. You might recognize her work from franchises like Assassin's Creed, God of War, Little Big Planet, Total War, and The Sims. We'll get started here just in a second. So as we do, please feel free to drop any questions you may have about the creative or technical challenges of game music composition or Winifred's own past work you may have in that questions tab in your chat window there. And we'll ask however many we have time for and get into talking about those. So with that, Winifred, you ready to get started here?
I'm looking forward to it. Hello, GDC Summer. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it's a cool experience so far, and I like the nice little one-on-one AMAs are really sweet. So I guess we'll just jump into it here, and then we'll pull some questions from chat. How does game composition differ from like other areas of music composition?
Oh gosh, great question. Game composition is kind of like a really different philosophy just at the core of it. I mean, when you're composing for a film, it's a linear experience. It's all pre-planned. It's got a beginning, a middle, and end. You're sort of composing to the dramatic beats on the screen. But it's a very preordained kind of thing. When you're composing for a game, it's a fluid experience. Everything depends upon the actions of the player, so you really don't know what's going to happen at any given time. And with that, you have to construct the music in kind of a modular way. It has to be put together in components that can be sort of assembled and disassembled based on what's going on, what the player's doing, and what activities they're involved in. The game engine has to essentially be able to take the music apart and then put it back together in different ways. And that's just really interesting because as a composer, it means I'm not thinking about beginnings and middles and ends. I'm thinking about states of being, of activity, of thought, of action, of ways to feel in any particular moment. And you express that musically. And then you create a whole assortment, a kind of a hodgepodge of those kinds of statements, those kind of musical statements that can be then sort of assembled into its own vocabulary, its own kind of peculiar grammar. It's really interesting work.
Whole complicated beast, because like I guess with most I don't know, narrative, you have that beginning and middle and your end, and that's like your safety blanket, but not quite having that in music seems a little intimidating.
It's true. When I first started, it was really hard to get your head around the idea of creating music that seems interesting and involved and has a lot to say, and yet doesn't seem to be going anywhere very aggressively. It isn't giving you signposts that are kind of pointing towards the direction that you're heading. Because when you do that, when you create big like set piece moments within a musical composition, then it really draws attention to itself, especially if the music was designed to loop. And then you can really feel the repetition happening. And that's a big issue to deal with just structurally in terms of music composition for games. You want to make sure that the music feels natural and as if it were being created specifically for the gamer's experience, for what they're doing. You don't really want to give away the magic trick that's going on underneath and all the mechanics that are happening. So you have to keep in mind the unique nature of game music when you're creating it so that it functions really well within the construct of gaming itself.
So we're going to kind of segue that into a question from chat here from Sophia in chat. They say hello and would like to know when you're analyzing or researching a genre for a project, what exactly do you kind of note down and analyze against? How do you transfer that research to your music?
Great question. Hello, Sophia. The research process is one of my favorite parts of the work that I do in games. And it's great with the video game industry and the kind of projects you work on because they're so varied. And some of them are really larger than life or in the speculative genres. So you get to create epic and expansive stuff that with really intense emotional undercurrents, and that's a lot of fun. And also, a lot of it can be influenced by period pieces. Some of it's historical, like the work I did on Assassin's Creed Liberation was set in 18th century New Orleans, so you had a lot of cultural influences there. And with that kind of project, first thing I would do is delve into research for understanding the story. I mean, I am as a part of the team creating the game, I need to understand the emotional content and the context of how the characters are feeling if I'm going to express that. Just as a baseline, even apart from what I'm going to do musically, I need to understand how everybody's feeling and what's going on. So I tried to do that kind of research, and also makes me feel more a part of the team and the project when I'm on the same page as everybody about what we're all trying to say with the project. But then apart from that, I start looking at is there any instrumentation that would be specific to the era, the location? Are there musical techniques that would have been favored by composers at the time? That kind of thing. That's really interesting. I did a lot of research on French Baroque musical forms for my work on Assassin's Creed Liberation, because that was the music that would have been popular at the time that the main character was having her adventures. So it was important for me to do that. And of course, since she was of African American ancestry, I also tried very much to understand that cultural influence in her experience. You know, those wonderful, strong primary harmonic colors and the really fantastic rhythms and instrumentation that I had to work with there. So just as an example of the kind of rich source material that you can kind of dive into, Assassin's Creed Liberation was really fantastic for me.
That'd be like a really interesting exercise and kind of stretching those research and like your different aspects of composition skills for
Mm.
games like that. Um,
Yeah.
to kind of merge a question from chat with something I'm curious about, we have a question. Have you ever had to make music for a game without seeing what it looks like? If so, what is that process like?
Yeah, yeah, that actually happens quite a lot, more than you think. And I think it has a lot to do with the way in which game development happens. If you're creating music for a film, you tend to be brought in when the film is somewhere near its final cut. You're not really creating music for the film while it's being shot or while it's in preliminary edits. And the composer needs to know what the final beats are, how the shots are going to go from one thing to another. But for games, the game tends to be very fluid and in development when I'm brought in. And sometimes there really isn't even anything playable yet. Or if there is, it's really early character designs with the arms jutting straight out and just sort of floating over some sort of really abstract looking geometrical grid. And it gives me no idea of what the game's going to look like or feel like. And you have to be able to sort of cope with that, kind of plumb the depths of your own imagination to kind of fill in those gaps. So that's why research really does help a lot there, because we have to kind of bring our own inner life to the envisioning of what it is we're scoring when we don't have those kinds of visual helpers to guide us along.
So, like, kind of in the same vein of that, Christian in chat wants to know how do you ensure that sound effects and music really mesh together really well and form a consistent experience as opposed to just kind of like a random mix that doesn't jar quite well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christian. And I think the best way to go about that is to have a really nice working relationship between the composer and the sound designer, the sound team, the audio director. We're all kind of on the same page and we're working together. And sometimes it's trial and error. The sound design team may not actually know what the sound effects are going to be doing when they ask me to compose the music. I might be ahead of them in terms of the workflow, and I deliver music for them. And then they experiment with the sound design and they come back to me and ask me to kind of tweak things if they're not sort of fitting together properly with the sort of sound design decisions that they're making for the game. Or on the other hand, sometimes they've just gone ahead and changed what they were doing to fit the music that I was delivering. I think it depends on priorities, on what people are happy with. And it's such a collaborative process. It's just so very fluid, and it's about personalities and artistic ambitions, and everybody's trying very hard to make sure all the elements come together. It's a conglomeration of so many different creative strategies. And so I think that's part of what makes game development so exciting, so many different viewpoints coming together.
Just kind of to expand on that, how long is your typical involvement in a project from like your very first kind of like plucking at strings to the final composition delivered to them? How long are you working alongside those developers?
Oh, great. That is a great question because it's hard to answer. It really depends on the project. I mean, I've been on indie teams that are really short development schedule, and I'm kind of in there hitting the ground running, just cranking out the tracks, and it's just maybe a month or so where I've completed all the work for it. And on the other end of the spectrum, I've been in projects that have had me working on and off for years while they're developing, and they'll come to me and ask me to deliver kind of a cache of tracks for them to incorporate based on where the game is at that time. And then they'll go off and they'll develop and they'll work on the project, and it'll be very fluid. They'll come back to me and say things like, oh, the game's completely different now, so we need you to revise the music in this way or that way. Or we're thinking about a different style, or this level now has been removed and we're now doing something different. So we're repurposing music in a different way, and we need you to deliver music in a different feeling or structured in a different way. The interactive implementation scheme may have changed. So that's very challenging and very interesting work. You know, there are a lot of different pitfalls to it, but also some really great things can come out of it. You know, it stretches you as a composer, makes you grow and look to yourself to think of different kinds of solutions to problems. So that can be a lot of fun.
Another question from chat here from Brian on themes and thematic development. Any suggestions on incorporating recognizable themes into content without getting samey or redundant through overuse?
Good question. Yeah. Themes are tricky in video games, particularly with looping content that's going to be repeated a lot. I mean, you can be hundreds of hours playing a game, and there are only a few games that are actually requisitioning hundreds of hours of music. So there's going to be repetition happening there, and it's a good point that you have to be very aware of that as an aspect of what you're doing. I kind of like to break themes down. I mean, you state them in a very recognizable and dynamic way when it's important at a set piece moment in the game, or maybe it's a part of the main theme, or it's a part of a main menu, and you really want to use it as a way in which you're creating a musical signature for the project. But then you can break it down into fragments like motives, small segments, just a few notes, something that might not even be consciously recognized as a part of that theme. And then you can sprinkle it elsewhere. And it just communicates in a subconscious way to the player, and it asserts the game's musical identity without really being overt about it. And you can also use them as figures, ostinatos. You can restructure a theme to be more of an underlying pattern that other original material might be on top of. And that's a way to also assert the theme without it being a foreground element. It's not something that is going to be front of consciousness, but it's still going to be there. It's going to be asserting an identity. And I think that's always a great thing to try to strive for, to sprinkle a sense of identity into everything you're doing.
It kind of builds into a question from Nikki in chat. Do you have a favorite leaf motif? If so, what is it? Kind of what's the formula for that?
Oh, gosh. In terms of well, the Assassin's Creed Liberation score was really strongly driven by leitmotifs. I had them for nearly every character, every one of the important characters, because there were so many, but all of the main characters had leitmotifs that returned. And I couldn't tell you if there was a favorite motif that I've used for a project. Although I do have to say that I had a lot of fun with the the core leitmotif for Spore Hero for Electronic Arts, because that was an opportunity to express it in so many different ways. Spore Hero was a score that was very influenced by world music. It's after all, it's a game about monsters wandering around a primitive world, and so I really wanted you to feel this sort of friendly world music atmosphere. And I was delving into all different kinds of world music for it. So taking the core theme, the leitmotif that's first expressed in the main theme, and then just re-expressing it in all of these different cultural musical styles and influences was tremendous fun. All kinds of different instruments, all kinds of different rhythmic constructs, and it made it a really fun puzzle for me to see how many different ways you can kind of turn a theme inside out and rediscover it as a composer and see what it can do.
Building that into a question from Tim, who says, "Hello, and thank you for answering our questions. What is your process to avoid overcomposing a section or scene in game? Can you share examples of how you've done that in the past?"
Good point. Yeah, you don't. It's like a fine line. You don't want to do too little. You don't want to do too much. If the music is too aggressive, it can really start to feel aggressively dominant in the experience you're having in the game, and you certainly don't want that. For Assassin's Creed Liberation, I had a four chord. Essentially, it's a theme, but it's also just a four chord pattern, very subtle, but it was something that was incorporated as essentially the central building block of the main theme of the game. This four chord pattern that repeated over and over and over again, and I was able to use that a lot in the game. And one of the virtues of it was that it was very subtle, very low keyed, almost subliminal in the sense that you could recognize it when it came back, but it wasn't really anything that would really arrest your attention. And so it was this stealth music, in just functionally speaking, for a stealth game, but functionally speaking, it was a stealthy construct that I could use to create a sense of identity without having to overwrite the piece in order to use a lot of really dynamic thematic ideas that would arrest the player's attention more aggressively.
So you've talked a little bit already about how you kind of do your research to get into like the period and spirit of the game. But what about genres in that sense? When you're researching for scores that you're not already deeply knowledgeable in the genre, what's your immersion approach? And when do you know you're ready to dive into creating something unique with your new material? And that's a question from Brian. I don't want to steal credit for that one.
Brian, nice question. And that is definitely something that we have to face a lot. I mean, if you're doing pretty well as a game composer, you're probably going to be scoring projects from a lot of different kind of game genres. And that can be pretty challenging. I remember when I was first hired to do the music for Speed Racer, I had to really look into what the musical scores are like for racing games. It's very techno-driven music, and that wasn't something I had done up to that point. So I got a chance to learn something really new and to kind of dive into the electronic sound palette and those really driving rhythms and that really dominant beat that just helps to accentuate the sense of speed in a racing game. So that was something I got to learn along the way. On the other hand, it was also tied into the Speed Racer intellectual property and the Wachowskis film that had just come out at the time. So it had to have this very eccentric and almost retro feel, and so I had to sort of juggle and merge together two ideas that were really opposite: a very retro inspired orchestral score with this very techno driving genre that really needed to be enhanced. I had to be true to it. It is a racing game, and you don't want to disappoint fans of racing games. I mean, there's an expectation there, and if the musical score is so different that it doesn't seem to have the spirit of the genre running through it, then it can start to feel like the music's sitting on top of the game and not really woven into it. And I didn't want that to happen with Speed Racer. So I ended up with this really eccentric amalgamation of styles and influences. And it was a lot of fun. I had a really good time working on that one.
To branch into some more like day-to-day operations, we got a couple questions here I'm going to fuse together. First one, well, I guess it's just from Dan Cooper in chat. Wants to know if you have any recommendations for effective time management strategies when you're composing or preparing to compose for a game.
Nice. Yeah. That is a really good thing to be thinking about, how to make sure that you're meeting deadlines. The first thing I do is make sure that I'm really well aware of when the deadlines are and how much material I'm going to need to prepare in order to meet them. Fortunately, I work with a music producer who helps me with the logistics. So just reminding me of when things need to be delivered and kind of general quality assurance so that I do a good job on meeting those deadlines and staying on schedule. I think the deadlines are going to help the most for staying on schedule and delivering in a productive way. You can look at your own speed in terms of how many minutes of music you create a day, and then figure out what your working schedule and your workflow should be like in order to meet those deadlines. I mean, everybody's going to have a different workflow, a different comfortable output per day. And that is going to be an important consideration when you figure out how you're going to schedule yourself, how much time you'll need to devote to different tasks each day. I think it's going to be a really personal choice too, because we're all very different in the way we approach music composition. So I wouldn't want to say there's one way of going about it that's going to be a one size fit all solution. But as long as you're taking those deadlines really seriously and kind of looking at yourself and asking yourself, what do I personally need to do to get those deadlines handled and to be on track? And I think you'll be okay then.
So for people looking to get into composing music, we have a question here from Mallory who wants to know, how does an aspiring composer work their way up? Do you start as a composer's assistant or maybe a transcriptionist? And then we also had another question asking about networking as a composer and kind of the same kind of trajectory.
Okay. All right, two-part question. Let's see how I do here.
Sorry.
Okay, hey, it's fine. Oh, this is the hey. Here we go. GDC Summer. So, so the first part of it was, is it good to start as a transcriptionist or a composer's assistant in order to make your way into the industry? Unfortunately, I don't actually know a lot about that one because that's not the way I started. I started in a really weird way. I kind of had the bolt of lightning story, and that makes me a bad person to ask when it comes to how to get into the industry. I happened to contact the God of War team right when they were looking for somebody to join the composer team on that project, and my timing just happened to be really, really good. So that was how I got my first gig. But you can't say, well, just send up a prayer and hope the timing is great. That isn't something that I could.
Cold calls don't work quite as well now as they used to, I don't think.
Well, I think it's still important to try to network. As the second part of the question, networking, I think, is still important. And doing something like this, being involved in conferences. I mean, of course, in-person conferences were really helpful for doing meetings and things. But this can still, I think, help to get a new composer out there in the industry. If you can set up even online meetings, that could be helpful, and just get involved in the community. Just even writing articles about what you've learned from past projects and offering them up to the game audio community can increase your presence, because it really does matter if people know you're there. And if you have had experiences, even working with student teams and or small indie projects, and you feel like you can share an experience with other people about what you've learned, that can be really invaluable in order to make people aware of who you are and what your skills are. I think that can be very helpful. And if you're a student and you can get involved with student teams, that's amazing, because you can meet people who then can be a network of contacts as you move forward into the industry, and you can keep in touch with each other, and eventually you could work together again in a more professional capacity. So that's really fantastic.
All right. Next question here from Nicholas in chat wants to know, can you speak to the public acceptance of video game music and the Library of Congress game music event you participated in?
Yeah, well, that was really exciting. I was asked to give a speech at the Library of Congress about game music, and it was the first event of its kind held at the Library of Congress, focusing specifically on game music. It was a great event. They had this whole arcade section where they had all of these retro games being played in these wonderful mahogany paneled rooms in the it was just in the Library of Congress. It was just an amazing thing to watch people really excited about that in such a hallowed setting. But I think it's important for just in terms of this Library of Congress event in which I was fortunate to be able to give a speech, and at other sorts of events like that, like symphony tours are another good example. I think they're great in elevating the awareness of game music within a larger community, getting people who might not be familiar with game music more acquainted with it, and to understand that it really isn't the bleeps and bloops of yesteryear, that it is something that has grown as games have grown, and it is now a serious art form that people who even aren't gamers could still appreciate. So symphony tours like the Assassin's Creed Symphony World Tour, in which I'm fortunate to have a composition featured, that is a great opportunity to elevate music from a game franchise and make more people aware of both the music itself and the franchise that it comes from. So it's a great vehicle for visibility. So I think more like that is fantastic. And things like the Library of Congress event are a great way to elevate the authenticity of what we're doing, so that people realize that there's a lot of artistry and heart that goes into this music. And there's a skill level there that can be appreciated by people who are looking for music just to be fans of. So I think that all of that kind of stuff is really important. And I'm very grateful that more of it's happening now.
Running out of time here, so I'm trying to sneak a few more quick questions in. Jeremy wants to know with who or what functional roles do you most frequently and closely interact with as a game composer? And I'm going to add on to that. Do you have any tips for kind of communication between yourself and the teams you're working with?
Good one. Yeah. Well, it's been my experience that that can vary really wildly, depending upon the type of team you're working with. If you're working with an indie team, you may be working with the grand poobah, the game director, the game designer, someone with that title, producer. You might be working with. Sometimes, if you're working with one of the larger publishers, you'll also be working with a producer because the music is being requisitioned by the publisher and not by the development team. So the publisher has a producer who's specifically assigned to oversee your work and make sure everything's on track. On the other hand, if you're working with the development studio itself, sometimes it's an audio director. If you have a well thought out team for audio within that developer, it might be the audio director, it might be a sound designer if it's a smaller development team and they don't really have a lot of audio folks. It just might be the sole audio person on that team you're talking to. And there have been projects I've worked on who they've had nobody on audio at all, and I've been talking to maybe a programmer or something like that. So it really does depend upon the structure of the development team itself as to who you're going to be talking to. In terms of communication, I think you have to be sensitive to the way in which the team wants to communicate, because that's key. Everybody's different. And you don't want to try to assert your own preferences onto a team. Some teams are really comfortable with emails. There's an audio director I've worked with quite a lot who writes very long, complex, and really helpful emails with lots of detail. And that's fantastic because then I can have them in front of me and have everything very solidly stated, and it's wonderful. So I love that. But there are other teams that really don't like to work that way. It's more freewheeling, and everything is about in the moment expression. So there's a lot of Skype conversation going on, or phone conversation if Skype isn't your thing, or Zoom, since that's where we are, or Zoom isn't your thing. So there's a lot of that kind of conversation happening. And if that's where the creativity is happening, that's where we need to be. We need to be comfortable with whatever communication form is at the heart of the way the team works, whether that's bulletin boards and Slack groups, or Discord, or onto a Zoom, Skype, or through long emails. Any way they want to do it, we need to be ready to do it that way. And we need to be very happy to do it that way. Usually when I talk to a development team and they're starting to just get a sense of how we want to communicate, I'll say, I want to talk with you guys in the way you normally do it. So how do you normally have these conversations? And then I'll work around that. And I feel like there's always a kind of a little sigh of relief on the part of the team. Oh, we don't have to change the way we do things. And that means a lot. So that I want to make sure that that's the way everything goes.
A lot of flexibility is important, it sounds like.
Mm.
I want to squeeze in one more question. It'll be a
Okay.
quick answer, I promise. Jennifer wants to know if there's any music composition book in general you've read during your career that's had an impact on you, or just any resources you want to offer people looking to learn more about this.
Okay. Well, in terms of a book, I've read quite a lot. I'm always going back to the techniques of orchestration, just because I find that dipping back into just the nuts and bolts of what we do is a really nice way to sort of touch base with the core of it. And if there is like a core tome that is your favorite book for just touching base with what it is to compose. It doesn't have to be any particular book, but something that's just at the ground floor. I think it's nice to have a book like that to come back to and to remind yourself of the things that were the most important just starting off. We can get really obsessed with some, highfalutin, complicated techniques and very ambitious, and we kind of go off on these tangents. And it's important, I think, to kind of step back periodically and just remember what music is at its heart. So that's the kind of stuff I like to revisit over and over again. Um, so I'm hoping I answered that question.
I know, I'm news editor at Gama Sutra, and not to promote my stuff too much or my site, but you do have a Gama Sutra blog where you talk a lot about all your like music background, and Library of Congress, you did a great blog on that. So that would be a great place to check out and find more information.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and I'm just going to have to say it, my book, A Composer's Guide to Game Music, that can be
Yes.
helpful, from the MIT Press.
All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone, for so many wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I hope you all have a wonderful GDC summer. There's plenty of other programming throughout today, the rest of today. We're just getting started today and tomorrow. I know particularly there's some GDC podcast live episodes tonight and tomorrow that I'll be on, that we have some great guests lined up. But there's tons of great other programming. So have a great day and enjoy your show. Thank you.